I want to be honest about that at the very start, because this is a story about a war that is still being fought. The 31st of August, 2024, the Kursk region of western Russia, flat farmland, shelter belts, the air hazy with late summer dust, and the particular grey of diesel smoke that hangs low when there is no wind. A Ukrainian recovery crew is moving along a farm road in a German-built Weissant, a mine-clearing and recovery machine on a Leopard 1 chassis. The man in the commander's hatch has a phone in his hand. We do not have his name, and I will not invent a person in order to tell it. What we have is his footage, published that day on a Ukrainian channel and reported the following morning in the defense press. What we can say about him with confidence is this: he is a recovery man. Dragging broken armour out of fields is his trade. He is, by definition, one of the very few people on that road qualified to understand instantly what is coming the other way. And what is coming the other way should not be there. It is a Challenger hull, British, 62 tons of it, tracks squaring off the mud, moving at the pace of a farm tractor, but where the turret should be there is a flat-welded superstructure and a folded crane arm lying along the deck, no gun barrel. Nothing on that vehicle is pointing at anything. Behind it, on the tow, is a Russian BREM-1, a recovery vehicle built on the T-72 chassis, a machine whose entire purpose in life is to drag Russian tanks out of trouble. He films it because it is absurd. The tow truck is being towed, and the thing doing the towing is a British tank with no gun, on Russian soil, of which there are precisely 2 in the entire country. He offers no explanation, nor at first did anyone else. When the clip surfaced, the argument was about whether Britain had quietly sent something new, whether the gun had been stripped off, whether the whole thing was a fabrication. Every one of those explanations was wrong. It was none of them. It was the most valuable armoured vehicle Britain sent to Ukraine, doing precisely the job it was designed to do, 70 years of doctrine arriving in one unremarkable frame of phone video. This is not a story about a tank without a gun. This is a story about who owns the ground after the shooting stops, because in armoured warfare there is a law that is old, unglamorous, and almost never mentioned in a headline, and it has decided more campaigns than any weapon ever built. The side that holds the ground collects the wrecks. Part 1. To understand why that piece of video mattered, you have to understand the logic it violated, and that logic was not stupid. It was arithmetic, and for most of the 20th century it was correct. Soviet, and later Russian, armoured doctrine was built on a foundation that Western armies have never been able to match and largely stopped trying to. Mass. Not just mass in the field, but mass in reserve. Long-term storage bases holding thousands of hulls, hundreds of vehicles nose to tail under the open sky, whole regiments of armour parked in rows and left to the weather. A tank in that system is not a treasured asset. It is a unit of supply, like a shell or a fuel drum, and the industrial machine behind it was designed from the 1930s onward to produce it faster than an enemy could destroy it. To understand what that crewman was looking at, we have to go back, not to 2022, but to 1943. The design philosophy that produced the wartime Soviet tank fleet deliberately traded refinement for output. Simplify the casting, shorten the engine life, accept a machine that will not last because statistically it will not need to. The average life expectancy of a tank at the front was measured in weeks, so building one to last for years was waste. That is not a caricature. It was a rational reading of an attritional war, and it helped win one. Follow that logic forward 80 years and you arrive at a settled position on battlefield recovery. Recovery is expensive. It requires a specialist vehicle that costs as much as a tank and carries no gun. It requires a trained crew who cannot be replaced by conscripts in a fortnight. It requires that vehicle to drive slowly, in daylight, to a place where something has just been destroyed, and to sit still, winching, for anything from 20 minutes to several hours, in full view of whoever destroyed it. Set against that, the alternative is simple. A replacement main battle tank pulled from long-term storage and reactivated costs somewhere in the region of $2 million, and the reported figures vary and are not officially published, so treat that as an estimate. A dedicated armoured recovery vehicle, by the same rough measure, costs about £1.5 million and can be lost on its first task. If you have thousands of hulls in the yards, the answer writes itself. Do not risk the specialist. Replace the casualty. That was the model, and I want to give it the credit it is owed, because a victory over a fool is not worth a documentary. They were not wrong that recovery under observation is lethally dangerous. They were not wrong that a recovery vehicle is defenceless. They were not wrong that a country with deep storage reserves can afford to abandon what it cannot easily save. Every one of those propositions is true, and every one of them was tested and confirmed in the first year of this war. I should say plainly that I have no quotation from the other side to offer you here. No senior Russian officer has published a defense of this doctrine that I can source and put in front of you. What I have instead is the behaviour, and in this case the behaviour is more eloquent than a quotation would have been, because the model worked. It worked in 1943, and it worked in the first weeks of 2022, and then it met a condition its authors had not planned for. It met an enemy who did not retreat. Part 2. The machine in that video is called the Challenger Armoured Repair and Recovery Vehicle. It was designed by Vickers Defence Systems, built on the hull of the Challenger 1 main battle tank, and it entered British service at the end of the 1980s. Around 80 were delivered to the British Army between 1988 and 1993, and sources differ slightly on the exact total, with some putting it at 74. A further 4 went to Oman. Its first operational deployment was the Gulf in 1991. Here is the design principle that governs everything about it. A recovery vehicle must be built on the same chassis as the tank it recovers, because nothing lighter can do the work. A 62-ton vehicle bogged to its belly in Ukrainian black earth cannot be pulled out by anything that will itself float on that ground. The mass is not a side effect. The mass is the tool. So it carries the same 1200 horsepower Condor engine as the gun tank, the same running gear, the same transmission family, and it moves at up to 59 kilometers per hour, with a range of about 500 kilometers. Wherever the squadron can go, the recovery vehicle can follow. What it carries instead of a turret is the interesting part. A main winch with a straight pull of 50 tons, rigged through a pulley block that the vehicle carries with it, that rises to 98 tons of pull, which is to say more than the weight of any tank on any battlefield, in any army, by a comfortable margin. A secondary winch whose only job is to help the crew drag the main rope out to the casualty, because the main rope is far too heavy for men to manhandle any distance. An Atlas hydraulic crane that lifts 6.5 tons at nearly 5 meters of reach, which is not an arbitrary figure. It is the figure required to lift a complete Challenger engine and gearbox out of a hull in the field. A dozer blade on the nose, used less for earth moving than as an anchor, driven into the ground so that the vehicle does not simply pull itself towards the casualty, instead of the other way round. A man-portable cutting system that will work underwater, a portable welder, and a high-mobility trailer that carries a spare power pack forward so that a tank with a dead engine does not have to go anywhere at all. The engine comes to the tank. Its armament, the entire armament of this 62-ton vehicle, is one 7.62mm general-purpose machine gun and a bank of smoke dischargers. It does not have the composite armour of the gun tank. It is steel, it can be given add-on protection, and it is still a vehicle that no sane commander would drive towards an enemy, which is exactly what it is for. On the 16th of January 2023, the British Defence Secretary stood up in the House of Commons and announced the package that would become the most photographed donation of the war. 14 Challenger 2 main battle tanks, self-propelled guns, 100,000 artillery rounds, 600 anti-tank munitions, bridging and minefield breaching equipment, spare parts to refurbish up to 100 Ukrainian tanks. Buried in that list, in 5 words, was the phrase Armoured Recovery and Repair Vehicles. No number was given. The world's press did not ask for one. The photographs the next morning were all of the tanks. The number, established later and now reported consistently, was 2. By the end of March 2023, the tanks were in Ukraine, assigned to the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, and the first photograph of one of the recovery vehicles was circulating online on the 28th of that month, identified by the American defense journalist David Axe. Ukrainian crews had been trained in Britain, not only to drive the gun tanks but to operate and maintain the recovery pair alongside them. The disposition was the standard British one. One forward with the tank squadron, one held back as the reserve, because the first rule of recovery is that the recovery vehicle is itself a casualty waiting to happen, and you never take the last one forward. 2 vehicles, for a front line that at its longest ran more than 1,000 kilometres. The reaction on the other side at first was amusement. A tank with no gun was a curiosity, a photograph to be shared, evidence that the West was sending Ukraine scrap. That reading lasted about a year, and then it changed completely, and the change is the subject of Part 4. Before that, one thing: what the 82nd Air Assault Brigade has done with these machines, on ground that has since been fought over 3 times, deserves to be understood rather than scrolled past. If this deep dive into British engineering is holding you, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it keeps this channel making them. Now, the record. Part 3. To see why 2 unarmed vehicles were worth more than the 14 tanks they arrived with, you have to zoom out from the machine to the institution that produced it, because Britain did not invent this vehicle. Britain invented the trade and then built a vehicle for it. On the 1st of October 1942, the British Army formed a new corps. It came out of a committee report on the use of skilled men in the services, and its purpose was to take repair and recovery away from 3 separate organisations that had been doing it badly between them and give it to one body of tradesmen, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Their motto is Arte et Marte, by skill and by fighting. Their ethos still is soldier first, craftsman always. Field Marshal Montgomery, who was not a sentimental man about support arms, said the new corps existed to keep the punch in the army's fist. They were formed in October. They were tested 3 weeks later. The Second Battle of El Alamein began on the 23rd of October 1942, and it was, by design, an attritional fight. Montgomery was losing something like 4 tanks for every one he destroyed. On paper, that is a catastrophe. In practice, he still held the advantage, and the reason is the whole of this argument in a single sentence. His losses were on ground he controlled, and the enemy's were not. A British tank knocked out on the 24th was recovered on the 25th, repaired behind the line and back with a squadron within days. A German or Italian tank knocked out on the same field was gone. When the line broke and the retreat west began, the Italian workshops had to destroy around 40 of their own tanks before pulling out, because there was no fuel and no time to take them. By the beginning of November, the German Armoured Corps in North Africa could field barely 30 tanks fit for action. The British could field more than 600. Those two numbers were not produced by better gunnery. They were produced by mechanics. The same corps put a machine on the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June 1944 that almost nobody has heard of. The Beach Armoured Recovery Vehicle. A Sherman with the turret removed and a tall waterproof tower built in its place, so that it could wade in nearly 3 meters of seawater and drag drowned and swamped vehicles clear of the tide line. Around 60 were built. Roughly 52 landed on D-Day. Their crews included divers, because somebody had to go into the water to attach the tow chains. In the first days they recovered hundreds of vehicles, and in doing so they kept the beaches open, which is another way of saying they kept the invasion supplied. That is the tradition that arrived in Ukraine in March 2023, in a package of 2. Now the number this entire film turns on. The open source project Oryx counts armoured vehicle losses in Ukraine only when they can be visually confirmed in a photograph or a video, which means every figure it publishes is a floor and never a ceiling. It also does something almost no other tracker does. It separates losses into 4 categories: destroyed, damaged, abandoned, captured. As of March 2024, Oryx had documented 2,856 Russian tanks lost, 1,886 of them destroyed, 153 damaged, 537 captured, 280 abandoned, 817 Russian tanks that were not destroyed. Tanks that were bogged, or broken, or out of fuel, or left running with the hatches open, and then simply changed hands. Nearly 1 in 3. Pause on that number, because it is the most important statistic of this war that almost nobody quotes. It is not a casualty figure, it is an inventory figure. It is the physical transfer of an armoured force from one army to another, one vehicle at a time by men with winches, and it inverts the arithmetic we started with. The storage yard calculation said replacement beats recovery, that a fresh hull at around $2 million is a better bet than risking a specialist vehicle worth about £1.5 million. That sum was correct in isolation and catastrophically wrong in aggregate, because it only balances if the abandoned vehicle is destroyed. If it is merely left behind, it does not leave the war. It changes sides. Every hull written off under that doctrine was not a loss of 1 tank. It was a swing of 2. The retreating army pays twice. It always has. The side that holds the ground collects the wrecks. And this is where the institution matters more than the vehicle, because the thing that could not be copied was never the winch. And if you were standing on that farm road in the Kursk region on a hazy afternoon in August, you would have watched it do the one thing every army in history has known, and most armies in history have forgotten. The side that holds the ground collects the wrecks. Britain has known that since El Alamein.